Welcome to this tutorial on how to paint a starry night sky in watercolors. You'll need some brushes. I've just got my two round brushes. I've got a 12 here, a nice big one, and a number 2. So anything you have works. So in every class, I've told my students, don't worry about going out and buying specific colors. Don't worry about buying specific art supplies. If you have any watercolors around, we can make them work, and feel free to ask questions and I'll try to answer them. So you need a couple of brushes. I like round brushes. You'll need some paper, and I've got a variety of little paper scraps here. You'll need some paint. So this is my paint palette. It's a $1.25 plate from the Dollarama, and I've even got a little bit of old paint here. So this is like a dried up chunk of paint. Paint never goes bad, the watercolor paint. Unlike acrylics, once acrylic dries, you can't use it again. It's really normal for paint to dry out. Like this is the inside of a tube here. So I usually like to work from tubes. I have a variety of colors for tonight's class, but if you do have an old tube and it's dried out, you can cut the tube open, kind of pry out the color, and I've got a little bit of phthalo green for tonight. But I do all my mixing on a nice big plate like this. So for tonight, since we're doing a night sky, you'll want a little bit of Payne's Gray. If you have it, it's a nice kind of cool gray. You'll want a color for the Aurora Borealis. Now this can be a green, it can be an orange, it can be really any color you want. I'm using an Opera Rose by Holbein. It's a nice pinky color. I usually suggest against using yellow, because when you mix it in with any blues you get green, and it makes it a lot simpler just to stick with kind of a limited palette here and stick with like a green or a purple or a pink. You'll need some blues as well, and any blues work. I've got an Indanthrone blue, I've got a phthalo, but anything will work, any blue. Preferably the darkest blue you have. So I'm going to just put a little bit on my palette here, work from a bit of that, and I'm just going to show you guys a little demonstration on kind of how to mix some light and dark colors. So I'm really trying to go back to basics for some of my students, and it's always good to kind of go back to some of the simple things. If you don't have a nice dark color and you're worried that you can't really get a nice dark kind of black, I'm going to show you guys a trick about that too. So we've got our paper, we've got our paint. I always suggest Arches paper, but to start with, we're going to just use a sample piece of paper. So if you have a scrap piece of paper, the back of a watercolor paper, that's good. And we're just going to do a little demo, a little bit of a kind of a warm-up. So I like Arches for my good paintings. This is a nice paper for scraps, and for student paper, it's not too bad. All right, so you'll need some water, you'll need some tape, painter's tape if you have it lying around. That'll be great to tape your paper down. Other than that, you're pretty good. And if you have it, this is to make the stars, just a cheap acrylic paint. A white gouache will work, and we'll talk about some other options as well, but this is going to be how we'll put our stars in afters. So I've put my colors on my plate here, and what we do is we always kind of give them a little scrub like this with some water, and we start to make these puddles. We always color from these puddles. We don't necessarily pick up the paint pure and then put it right to the paper. We're always mixing. So if anybody doesn't have a really dark blue color too, this is what I was going to mention. You can take a little bit of a brown, your burnt umber, a burnt sienna works really well, and mix it in with some blue, and you can get kind of a gray dark color. Do you see how it kind of adds a bit of contrast and mixes in? So this is the kind of the goal for today, is to mix like a dark kind of inky blue to make our night sky. If you're ever in the country and looking up at the stars, the sky's never pure black, so we don't want to mix a pure dead black, but we do want a nice inky blue, if that makes sense. It's important to get it to the right consistency, and if you're new, it's totally all right to kind of go back and forth and to wonder, how much water do I add? I always say, in a nutshell, you want it to be really wet. If I pull my brush through it, I want to be able to see the white of the plate underneath. And I want it to be very liquid, and I want to be able to load my brush. I'm turning my brush in here, and I'm really loading my brush up with all that beautiful color. So, and you want to mix a lot more than you think you do too. That's another thing for beginners. Once we start painting, you don't want to go back and start to mix different colors. So it is really important to take a minute, really mix your colors and get used to them, and get them ready. So I always use the stir fry analogy. Just like when you're making a stir fry, you don't want to put the meat in and then start cutting vegetables. You really want to have everything cut and ready to go. I'm just dabbing up some of that excess water with a paper towel. All right, so I've got a nice kind of dark color, and I'm just going to show you guys a sample when we're painting. So pick up a bit of that nice dark color and put some on a scrap piece of paper. This is kind of how we'll start to see how dark it is. Do you see how I can still see the white of the paper? That's what we want. That's a sign that this is a good kind of medium value mix that we want. When we put our paint down on the paper, we don't want to really be mucking around in it. Once I put it down, I don't want to keep blending. I don't want to keep scrubbing because we really want things to mix organically on the paper and to look really fresh. So this is called a wet on dry. My paper is dry and I'm just adding some of that wet paint. For the technique that we'll be doing tonight, we'll be doing a wet on wet, and that is where we wet our paper first and then we add the wet paint to it. And I'll show you the difference. So I'm wetting my paper. I always tell my students, wet it a few times. It takes a minute for the paper to absorb some of that extra water. You don't want like a lake of water on top. You just want it to be kind of like a velvet and very, very wet. So when I'm doing wet on wet technique, when I add my paint, just like this to here, it's going to start to spread out. It's going to start to mix with the water and start to kind of create a design. So when we're doing our night sky, this is exactly what we'll be doing. We want to cover this area with that nice dark mixture that we made, that nice blue, that inky blue, and we'll want to be covering it as much as possible. But do you see the difference? If my paint's too watery, it just spreads out, it's very light. We do want it to get kind of dark, so we do want to make sure our mix is nice and punchy and dark. So here I've got a nice kind of punchy mix, and I think that's a pretty good kind of consistency. So I can spread it around just once kind of with my brush, and that's a good way to kind of cover a large area. Now you can see those stripes where I did that motion, that top down kind of zigzag motion. It's really easy to see the stripes. If you get that, sometimes wait a little bit because they'll start to even out a little bit. And as the water kind of spreads in and everything starts to absorb, that's not going to be as noticeable. The one thing you don't want to do is go back in and keep kind of mucking into it. But if I added another color, which is what we're going to do tonight, so if I added my Aurora Borealis color, I'm adding it in here, it's spreading around nicely, right? Do you see how it's starting to mix? It's giving me nice soft edges. So the trick too is a lot of people do wet and wet, and I tell people not to go over the same area once. So we get a lot of new painters that start doing kind of polka dots, and they get very polka dotty paintings because I say don't go back into it. You can use your brush to create these strokes to move things around on the paper, and I always say your brush stroke is your signature, so kind of be free with it. Push the color around, that's what you want to be doing. If you're really new, before you even start on a good painting, try your wet and wet technique a few times. Try it on a piece of paper, kind of experiment with it. It is really kind of, an unforgiving medium, so once you start on your good one, it is hard to correct mistakes. So if you're brand new, really take the time to get a feel for it. And also, if you're brand new and you make a mistake, you don't love how your painting's turned out with, don't be hard on yourself. This is going to take a little while to learn. I always kind of figure that with watercolor, there's quite a learning curve, if that makes sense. To learn how to kind of basically control watercolor, there's kind of a very steep little curve at the front. And then people get, I find my students get kind of competent, and they start to feel like they know what they're doing. But then there's another very steep curve because mastering the techniques can take a long time. So it's kind of a very organic and free kind of process, but it can be very frustrating for people as well because sometimes you do have to wreck a lot of paintings before you can kind of get good. So that's in a nutshell kind of the two techniques that we're going to be doing and the two techniques that you really want to focus on. So let's dive in and let's give this a shot. So I'm working about 5x7, 4x6, and that's a great thing to do. I always suggest for new painters to work smaller. It'll go faster for one. You don't have to worry about drying times as much as you would on a large sheet. And yeah, you can get a lot more paintings done with a lot less materials. Plus there's something about the pressure, right? It takes a little bit of the pressure when you're just working on a little piece of paper. If your painting doesn't turn out well tonight, it's just a little square paper. We can just throw it out, start again. And then even with this whole class, it should be, almost an hour. So it's not like you're out hours and hours and hours making a masterpiece. So that's kind of one of my favorite things about watercolors. Um, there's very little prep time involved. Whoops. And it just is, I don't know, I just love watercolors. So for those of you that don't know me, I've been teaching for, I think, 3 years, and I've been a watercolor artist for about 4. I've always been involved in art, though. I went to the University of Guelph for their studio art program. I've done photography, I've done oils, acrylics. I've kind of been all over the place and tried a lot of mediums. But about 2015, I picked up watercolors again, and I just kind of fell in love with the medium, and that's been my medium of choice ever since. So what I'm doing is I'm just taping my paper down. I'm taping it directly to the surface. You can tape it to like a cereal box board or something like that if you don't want to wreck your table. Watercolor's pretty forgiving. You can usually wipe it up, so you don't have to worry too much about your kitchen table, but some of the colors can stain. So if you are a little bit concerned, definitely tape your paper down to like a cardboard box or something like that, or another piece of paper or something, just to kind of protect your table. So I've taped everything down, and we're going to go in with wet and wet, but first we want to make sure we mix up all our colors. So I'm going to make my Aurora Borealis a nice pink color. I've got a nice inky color mixed here. So what this is a combination of some of my dark blue and a little bit of my Payne's gray to make a nice inky. I think I've said inky a lot this class. A nice inky mixture. So we're covering a large area too, so my other advice is let's use a big brush to start. Use a number 10, well, use a number 12 if you have it. And we're really going to want to try to cover that area as quickly as possible. So use a big brush. If you're doing wet and wet, you're covering a big area and you're finding you're not getting through it fast enough, or you're having a lot of stripes or inconsistencies, try either using a smaller kind of piece of paper or a bigger brush. You really have to size your brush to your artworks, and a lot of the times people use a brush that's way too small. So I'm really mixing a nice big pile of a nice inky black. So there's that blue, and I think that's a pretty good color. I'm pretty happy with that. And it's nice and dark. We are doing a night sky, so we want to go pretty dark. All right, so purple makes a nice Aurora Borealis. I'm using just pink. You can see where I have a little bit of a blue here as well. We can kind of mix a variety of colors into our sky, and this is what I like about using a big plate like this, is I can have a variety of different colors all ready to go, and I just have to pick it up. But I have a whole spectrum of colors between black and gray, blue and pink and purple, so I have a lot of options to pick from. So when I wet my paper and go in wet and wet, I can pick from a variety of different colors, and that's going to help create kind of not this one flat homogenized kind of painting. I'm going to get a lot of depth and a lot of vibrancy. So I'm going to just kind of start by wetting my paper, and do you see how some of it, this is what a lot of beginners, they kind of miss little areas. So do go over it a few times. Wet your brush really liberally, and even if you've got like a lot, that's all right. We don't want that lake to stay there, so we can spread it out. I know I said don't muck around, but if it's just the clear water, you can as much as you want. If you're using an inexpensive paper, be careful, because sometimes too much scrubbing can really affect it. So just a little bit of an aside. So I've really wet my paper here. I don't have that lake of water on top. You can see that it's just like a nice, very wet velvet stage. And I'm going to dive in with my color here. And I'm going to start to cover basically my whole background. So I know that in the original, there's these trees. We're going to paint those over top, so I don't have to worry about anything right now. I'm just going to take my color and start covering my page. And you see how I'm using kind of organic brush strokes? I'm not mixing in the same area too much, leaving some of these white kind of holes, if that makes sense. So I'm going to go in and switch my colors. I'm going to grab some pink, and I'm going to put that in here too. So the trick to making a nice wet and wet sky is not adding extra water. So you did hear that I rinsed my brush. As soon as I rinsed it, I dabbed it on a paper towel, because I don't want to be adding extra water. A lot of new people will go and rinse their brush, then bring back a sopping wet brush, and when that's completely wet, you're adding more water to this, and that's going to create blooms and things like that. So again, covering the whole area. I can keep going back in and mixing. And you see how some of my area is a little bit bluer? Some of it's got a little bit more of the gray. I'm going to add a little bit more Payne's Gray to my palette here. Payne's Gray is kind of a cheater gray. I don't usually use it a lot in my paintings, but for something like this, it's pretty good. I talk a lot about color theory in my classes. So I'm putting a little bit more of that darker mixture around the edges, the bottom. And you see I did rinse my brush in between colors, but I'm drying it before I pick up some more. There we go. And then I'm adding some of that. And as the pink mixes in with the blue, in some areas it's going to turn a little bit purpley. And that's all right. It's all this mix on top. When I'm doing the Aurora Borealis, I tend to kind of do it in like a stripe. But this is where everybody's is going to be unique and new. Everyone's going to have their own kind of signatures. So I can keep playing and keep adding paper until I see that it starts to get too dry. So it's still that nice velvet stage. I do want to follow my own advice and not overwork it, not muck around too much. But you do have this kind of wiggle room to add more color, to fiddle around. As long as you're not adding more water to your mix, you should be all right. But see how I added some nice dark color in there? I can still do that. And you see the paint's still mixing, it's still blending a bit. But it's the slowing down. This is really experience. To know when to stop, to know when it's getting too wet, to not add too much color. The only way you can really kind of find that perfect spot is practice. You know, you'll know what the paper looks like, you'll know when it's too much, too little, and there's no way to really fast track that. It's just a lot of experience. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm taking my paper towel here. We've worked with a lot of water in this wet and wet mix. I'm going to take my paper towel and I'm going to wipe along the borders, and that's going to help me to avoid getting blooms around the edges, because sometimes the water likes to hang out here and then it squeezes back onto the paper and creates these blooms. If you have an inexpensive paper, or even maybe you have too much water, if you have a chunk with too much water, like a little puddle, you can take a thirsty brush and you can soak it up. So I've dried my brush here. And then if you touch to any areas where you might have a puddle, it's going to soak up that extra water. It's going to help it dry evenly. So you don't want to really dab, you don't want to like spread the color around or really move it. You just want to take that tip and just put it in and soak it up. Thirsty brush. All right. So I want this to dry so I can do a little bit more work to it. So I'm going to use my hair dryer. So you'll notice it dried a lot lighter. Watercolor dries 20 to 60% lighter, and it depends on a lot of things. Wet and wet tends to be closer to the 60% lighter, and wet on dry tends to be a little bit less. But if you find now that your painting is looking a little bit too light, it's not looking nighttime sky, like it looks like an evening sky, then we can always go back and wet it again and add more. So I'm going to show you exactly what I'm going to do. I like to have some darkness around the corners, and I went pretty bold, so I'm actually pretty happy with how dark mine is. But maybe I want a little bit more pink there, so I'm wetting my entire area again. Now, if you have professional grade watercolors, they're not going to go anywhere. Once they're fully dried, you can wet the paper again. They are locked in, so you don't have to worry about that. So just like the wet and wet technique, I wet the entire area with clean water, and I'm just adding some extra dark to my top here, and it's going to do the same thing. So this is called a glaze. We're using the wet and wet technique, but we're just adding more color. And what I'm going to do is add a little bit more of that Opera Rose. Love this color. I usually use a quinacridone magenta, but the Opera Rose is a nice kind of pinky color. So look at, I can even daub it on. Like, I can really have some fun with this. So this is just me splattering the color on. You can really kind of loosen up and be flexible. So I'm just going to leave it like that. I've got a punch more color. I'm happy with that. And I'm going to dry it again. I mentioned about using the wet on wet. I can use that same mixture now, and I don't even have to worry about going too much darker, because it's going to dry not quite as light as the wet on wet. So I'm looking into that same mixture, and I'm going to just start to draw my trees here. And trees are something that frustrates people. I usually start with my line down the center, and then I usually just kind of wiggle my brush kind of back and forth. And this is how I draw my trees. And I don't worry too much about making it look exact. If you do really well with a reference photo, by all means, Google some pictures of trees. That can really help some people. You just having that tree in front of you to see. So do you see how my trees are just kind of... I didn't go straight to black, and this is something that's really important. A lot of people see this tree silhouette and they immediately go and mix a really, really dark black. And I don't want you guys to do that. I want it to still be dark, but I still want to see that transparency. Transparency is so important with watercolor. As I'm pushing it around on my plate, I want to be able to see that white through it. So vary the shapes of your trees. Wiggle back and forth, and this will have your own personality. Everybody's trees will be a little different. Make maybe a tall one up here. If your paint starts to bleed like this, that's a sign that your paper is still a little bit damp. So be careful with that. It's probably best to stop, let it dry naturally, don't blast it now, and then start again if you do get some of that bleeding. See, I definitely got a bit of bleeding in that tree there. We'll try to cover it up in a bit. All right, so I'm kind of following it down. Well, that's pretty good. So we're really glazing this up. So I'm going to give it a blast, and I'm going to actually do another row of trees. Perfect. And since we didn't go straight to black, we've got a nice kind of hazy tree back here. I'm going to go a little darker. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to take a little bit more of that Payne's gray, a little bit more of that blue. I'm going to make another mix, and I'm just going a little bit darker. Do you see how it's nice and inky and a lot darker? I'm going to do one more row of trees. And you see that now that it's a little bit darker, the trees in the back are going to kind of look like they're behind a little bit. So this is kind of a little bit more advanced. If you just want one row of trees, that is a-okay. When I'm teaching this to beginners, we usually just kind of worry about one tree. One row, I mean. But just for some of you guys that have been here for a while. Just kind of going back and forth. And it's going to kind of create a little bit of depth. And do you see that mistake one up here where it started to bleed? I'm going to kind of go in there just with one more tree, and we're just going to disguise it. So it's true that you can't really erase watercolors. We can sometimes fix little areas that we don't like. And take your time too. I do this demonstration really fast. There's my other tree here. Maybe I'll do one more down here. All right, I think we're ready to put on the stars here. So what I like to use is a little bit of acrylic paint. You can use a gouache. Gouache is an opaque watercolor. You can use gel pens if you have that. So if I had a gel pen, I mean, which I do, you could literally put your stars in like this. And it's a little bit more labor intensive. It's a little less organic, but it's a good solution if you don't have paint. You can use a paint pen, but I'm going to use a little bit of this gouache. And you'll want to put it on something separate. I'm just going to put it on a scrap piece of paper. If I put it directly on my palette, it's going to mix with all that blue. It's not going to look as nice. So we really want to keep it fresh. So we're going to splatter this on, but right now it's a little too thick. So I'm going to add some water. Now, if your water is looking a little blue from all our background work, you might want to get some fresh water. See how mine's a little blue? I'm not going to get up and get new water. It's okay for me, but that's a good trick. Use some fresh water. So, and there's that nice texture. I've kind of put it down to a watercolor painting texture here. And I'm going to actually use a toothbrush for this splatter. Love using these old toothbrushes. I'm going to dab in here. Just pick up some color. Now here's what everybody does is then they go right like this, and if you've got a lot of paint on there, you're gonna get a big old blob. So try to dab the top, and I hold it like up and down like this, and I put my thumb here, up and down, and I splatter. So just kind of dragging my thumb through it. That makes the best splatter. Like it's really like a galaxy. And it's a really nice fine splatter. So if you don't have a toothbrush, you can use your brush, use your regular brush, dab it in there, and you can hold your finger out and you can do some bigger splatter like this, and you're gonna have to experiment with how wet to get the paint. If you don't want to wreck this, try it out on a spare piece of paper, because it is easy to get some big blobs, and if you don't want to, you kind of want to know what you're doing a little bit. You also have to wait until the paper underneath is bone dry, otherwise you're going to get some funky splatters. So there we go. See, sometimes you get these. I don't hate these. They're fun. You can also kind of flick the paint kind of naturally, and it just depends on your brushes. These brushes are quite soft because they're natural hair, so they tend to do some of this. Sometimes an old acrylic brush is your best friend. Not using your good brushes to do this technique is sometimes a really good idea. So I got some of those splatters, but I don't mind. To me it looks like shooting stars or whatever. You can sometimes save it. If you get a big blob, you can take kind of a clean paper towel and you can daub some of it up. And that sometimes helps. But generally, once the paper is down, once the paint is down, it's down for good. Really important too that if you don't want it to look as snowy, maybe you could put a paper towel over top of your trees so that you don't get them in front of your trees. That tends to make it look a little bit more like snow. But it's a really versatile technique. Again, if you cover up your trees, it's going to look like a snowy night. So this is a great Christmas card kind of motif. But otherwise, you get this nice galaxy effect. You can always go back in with a brush too and add a few big stars too. But I kind of call this like micromanaging. We just kind of want it to be free, and we don't want to overthink it too much. So that's in a nutshell. I think I say in a nutshell a lot during my classes, but this is basically it. It's a very simple painting. It's really lovely, and it's a kind of motif that you can do again and again and again, and it's such a great way to practice your wet and wet technique and to practice your glazing and just to practice kind of mindlessly. You don't have to have a picture in mind. It doesn't have to look exactly like anything. It's just a really good kind of technique piece, like practicing your scales or arpeggios if you're a musician. It would mean a lot to me if you guys could share it, get the word out, and hopefully we'll have even more people watching on Tuesday. All right. Thanks, everybody, and stay safe.